Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Strobe Talbot, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to a conversation that I hope will engage as many of you as possible. Bruce Riedel and I go back a ways. We got to know each other in the 1990s when we were working on a part of the world that he's going to be focusing on here, which is to say South Asia, which included primarily for us at that time India and Pakistan, two countries that have an intense interest in Afghanistan, which is the subject of his new book. And Bruce and I came to Brookings around the same time. He is a 30-year, or 29-year, I guess, a veteran of the intelligence community, not just the Central Intelligence Agency, but he also did significant stints at the National Security Council staff in the White House, working both on the Middle East and on South Asia. And he's not only a superb analyst, but I can attest that he is a very good diplomat and policymaker as well. And he runs our intelligence project here in the foreign policy program. So let's get started just with Bruce giving you the short version of what is a book much meatier than the thinness of it would suggest. It's packed with information, a lot of which was new to me, and it has a very powerful thesis, which, Bruce, if you would share with the group, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thank you, Strobe, for being here. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank all of you for coming. What we won is a book about a successful intelligence operation. The war in Afghanistan, or more properly, the war against the Soviet 40th Red Army in Afghanistan, that began on Christmas Eve, December 1979, and ended in December 1979, ended in February 1989 with the retreat of Soviet forces across the Amur River back into the Soviet Union, was a global game changer. One part of that is pretty obvious. The war ended the myth of the invincibility of the Soviet Army. From 1942 on, the Soviet Union had never lost a battle. The perception was the Red Army was invincible. It was not. It was defeated in Afghanistan, and to add insult to injury, it was defeated by basically illiterate Afghan tribesmen assisted by the United States Central Intelligence Agency. The Soviet Union would probably have collapsed at some point anyway, but the Afghan war turns out to have been a precipitating event in making that happen. February 1989, the Soviets leave. Within 6 months, the Berlin Wall fell, and even less time, the Warsaw Pact as a military alliance had imploded. For the United States, it was a remarkably cheap victory. It's very difficult to know in retrospect exactly how much money we spent on the operation in Afghanistan. Covert operations are by definition covert, and they don't publish how much money was spent. But a conservative estimate is that the US spent between $3 and $4 billion in arming the Mujahideen in the 1980s. At its peak, the CIA task force that ran the operation in Afghanistan had roughly 50 people in it. I would submit to you, in the history of the federal government, there are very few federal projects involving so few people and so little money that had literally so much bang for the buck as this one did. Not only did the Cold War come to an end, but the threat of thermonuclear war, which had stood over the world during the Cold War, essentially came to an end as well. But in retrospect, while we can see it was a global game changer in that respect, it was also a global game changer in another respect. This was the beginning of what we now refer to as the global jihad. I want to be very careful here. The notion that the CIA created al-Qaeda is, in my view, bad history. We did not create al-Qaeda. That's not how we operated in Afghanistan. The CIA in Afghanistan was the quartermaster of a war. That's a phrase Bob Gates gave me in an interview for the book. We didn't train anyone. CIA officers never went into Afghanistan. Not a single CIA officer was wounded or killed in the war. We had no casualties because we took no risks. All the risks were taken by other people, principally the Afghans and the Pakistanis. The book is organized to look at the different players in the war, starting with the Afghan communists and then the Soviets. The Russians made almost every conceivable bad decision you could make in this war, beginning with the intervention to start it, which the CIA completely was surprised by. The Soviets' leadership was aging, ill, largely dysfunctional. The principal advocate of going in was the then head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov. He thought it was essential that they went in. Initially, the Politburo did not want to go in and then changed its mind. The Soviets then made another disastrous decision in retrospect, which was to under-resource the war. The Soviet Union put in about 100,000 soldiers to win the war in Afghanistan. In contrast, when it went into Czechoslovakia in 1968, they used 500,000 men. Now, anyone who looks at the map of Czechoslovakia and Afghanistan is going to see that the place where you needed 500,000 men was not Bohemia and Moravia, but the mountains of Afghanistan. That decision meant many things, one of which was they could not close the border with Pakistan, and Pakistan became the base for the Mujahideen. But more than the base, Pakistan, and particularly its intelligence service, the ISI, was the general headquarters of the Mujahideen. It provided the leadership, it provided the strategy, it provided the tactics. And if this war was anyone's war, it was Zia-ul-Haq's war. Zia-ul-Haq was, of course, the military dictator of Pakistan in the 1980s. He is the person who made every critical decision about the war. He liked to tell his director of ISI, I want this to simmer just right. Don't let it boil too much, but always make sure the water is getting hotter and hotter for the Soviet Union. He made the decision to provide arms to the Mujahideen. He organized the political leadership of the Mujahideen to be essentially his puppets. He decided which groups got which equipment. He decided that ISI teams would go into Afghanistan and actually command the Mujahideen on the battlefield. He decided that the Mujahideen would cross the Amur River and take the war into the Soviet Central Asia. And he decided when he wanted to bring the Stinger into the war. I know you all think it was Charlie Wilson's war. It wasn't. It was Zia-ul-Haq's war. The other key outside player was the Saudis. The Saudis matched our $4 billion dollar for dollar in government funds. That's well known. What's less well known is that they raised private funds as well. Rich Saudis donated enormous amounts of money to the war. Again, it's hard to know how much, but probably at its peak, Saudi private donations amounted to about $20 million a month going to the Mujahideen. The man who organized that was the then governor of Riyadh province, Prince Salman, who is today the crown prince of Saudi Arabia and heir to the throne. There's, of course, another very famous Saudi who was involved in the story, and that's Osama bin Laden. And I spend a lot of time talking about his role as basically the combat engineer of the Mujahideen. He built a base for the Mujahideen inside Afghanistan with the ISI's help that was state of the art. It had modern hospital, had a VIP hotel, and had miles and miles of underground tunnels filled with ammunition. Just a brief word on the US role. The US role was a bipartisan, agreed war effort. It was initiated by President Carter. President Carter was caught off balance by the Soviet invasion, but within 2 weeks, Jimmy Carter devised the strategy that the United States would pursue for the rest of the war, and he assembled the coalition of states to support it. Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, China, which was a key supporter of the war effort, Egypt, and the United Kingdom and others, all were brought together. Under the leadership of Carter and Brzezinski, the strategy and tactics of the war and the grand coalition of diplomacy that supported it secretly was developed in the last week of December and the first 2 weeks of January. It had support from Democrats and Republicans. When Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981, he essentially just continued the Carter policy for his entire first term in office. Then, in 1986,